Yours, Damon. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And it's a pity you're not here, but maybe next time. And thank you very much for accepting our invitation. The floor is yours. I will help managing questions and everything, so that you can concentrate on your talk. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And I do miss being in Italy. It's been a couple years now, and I usually go every year. So it's an opportunity that definitely I wish I had taken this year. Unfortunately, the other circumstances prevented me from being there in person, but um, it's a pleasure to join you even virtually. And I understand that most of the talks are focusing on simulations. And so I know people are probably familiar with my work on experimentation. So this talk focuses largely on new work that's very theoretical. It's focused on sort of a new theory of how networks operate in the process of identifying influencers. Um, and what I tried to do with this study and in the presentation here is to focus on how you develop, the way we develop this theory and then establish kind of boundary conditions for when it would apply, when it wouldn't, and then ways we marshaled new empirical evidence to test a theory. I think that one of the shortcomings of the large sort of data science approach is that it undervalues really the importance of doing serious theoretical work to establish empirical conditions under which theories should be tested and empirical conditions under which they're less relevant. So with this study, we endeavored, instead of building an experiment specifically to test this one theory, we endeavored to look at just large-scale studies that had either been done already or that were being done at the time to see if we could make predictions about what would happen in those studies based on this theory. And so these were, large open-ended studies in uncontrolled settings. And to me, that's a very powerful form of empirical evidence, and it's a great thing to think about when you're building a new theory of, how influence works, is to always figure out ways of marshaling new and compelling evidence for it. And one of the upshots, I think, for a lot of people building simulations in social science is, well, how can we ultimately use this? Where would we apply it? And my view is very clearly that you really can't apply empirical work to policy unless you have a good theory telling you where and what the situations are where that theory would actually work. Because there are many situations where even the best theories don't apply, right? This happens in physics, biology, and in sociology as well. So for computational social science, I think one of the most important things is when you're developing this sort of theoretical and empirical strategy for your work is to always have an eye on when that work is going to be applied, being able to sort of draw clear boundaries for policymakers about the cases in which this theory, once it's giving good empirical evidence, would actually work. So I'm going to present to you today, at the end of the talk, a very large scale, like nationwide study that was implemented in Malawi to shift large scale behavior based on this theory of influence. And my contention is you could have only done this if we developed the theory the way we did. It allows us to do this kind of policy work. So the structure of the talk is I'll talk about this new theory and how it shifts our thinking about networks and influence. Then I'll talk about the empirical studies we did, and then I'll talk about the new policy applications. And hopefully that'll give you kind of a complete picture of how everything ties together. This work is not discussed in my new book. Parts of it are discussed in Change, How to Make Big Things Happen. But this paper actually came out after Change. This came out in Nature Com just last year. So this is relatively new work for us. And I think it's important because it takes the idea, which complex contagion, a lot of you are familiar with, and uses it to kind of rethink what the notions of centrality are, and really the notions of distance are within social networks. All right, so the place to start here is, this age-old question has been around since the 50s, at least, which is, well, if we're trying to initiate some kind of change policy, it's a very strong intuition. There are certain people who are going to be more influential than others. Now, the big shift here in the 1970s and 80s was this first point, that it's specific locations. Now, it seems obvious to a lot of us who do network science today, but you remember at that point, and still for a lot of non-computational scientists, the right intuition is, well, like find the charismatic people or the people with certain personality attributes. Like you looked at the qualities of the individual. And it was a real shift in structural thinking to say it's not so much the characteristics of the personality of the person so much as where they're located. You could put anybody in this spot and that person would be influential. So that's kind of the structural advantage perspective. And the concept that people came up with, again, this dates back to the 1950s, and it's the concept we've used ever since, is that really it's about centrality. The most highly central people are basically the most influential people. So it was, scholars like Rappaport and Horvath and Solomonoff, like the real origins of like networks and graph theory in the U.S. that developed these concepts, and then Granovetter, of course, picked these up and formalized them with the strength of weak ties. And he has this great statement where he says, "Look, since resistance to a risky or deviant activity is greater than to a safe or normal one, individuals with many weak ties, so highly connected, central people like degree centrality, are best placed to diffuse such a difficult innovation." Um, so what that means in our sort of modern terms is that if you're looking at a large graph like this, obviously there's a person who looks like they're in the middle, and that person has a lot more weak ties, right? So that gives us a really clear conception of what we mean by the center, what we mean by the periphery. Someone in the center has more ties, and also it's not just, and this is a subtlety here that a lot of people overlook when we say degree centrality, someone has lots of ties. Granovetter is also pointing out it's not just they have more ties, those are weak ties. So they're ties that are shooting out in all directions. So they're getting lots of coverage. People in the periphery tend to have fewer ties, and also those ties tend to be clustered strong ties. So it's both the quality of the tie and the number of ties that's different between the center and the periphery. So of course, just quick rehearse, the concept of virality, a viral contagion, very easily enters a network that's centralized, gets to the central person, and then that spreads to everybody. It's something we're all familiar with. Obviously, the network on the right is one where, because it's peripheral, people have fewer connections. It's harder for this sort of thing to get started in a network. Now, what that gives us is kind of what I refer to as like the good old-fashioned theory of diffusion, which has been around, like I think Katz and Lazarsfeld, 1954, really were the first people to kind of formalize this in a general social science context. This has been around since like 1948, 1949 in a theoretical context. Basically the idea that if you're looking at spreading, what you're going to find is that it's really when it hits a highly connected person at the center that something catches on, spreads from there, and just kind of goes from the core or the center of the network out towards the periphery. But here's where it gets interesting, is that for the first time in the last 20 years, we've had excellent data on how these kinds of spreading processes work. And as I'll mention, these data actually, when you look closely, correspond to things that we understood back in the 1970s, but didn't really know how it fit into a picture of like network science. But now that we've been able to study these kinds of processes, like in the growth of Arab Spring in Egypt and the spread of technologies like Facebook and Twitter, what you actually see when you look at the network maps and the growth process is that they tend to take hold out in the periphery. And interestingly, they don't just jump to the center and spread from there. These behaviors actually cascade around the peripheral structure of the network and then reach the center toward the end. So this is a curious spreading process because it contradicts everything that our theory has told us since the 50s. It contradicts the strength of weak ties. It contradicts the well-known ideas of small worlds. It contradicts the classic ideas of influence and opinion leaders. So it's like it's a very different perspective on where the center of the network is. And so this idea, you'll see the dates here are pretty interesting because it's not just like social media studies and modern, vast volume data studies that show us this. If you look back in 1966, 1965, 1970, there are already studies pointing out this tension. And these studies, interestingly, are prior to Granovetter's strength of weak ties. So there was already this issue, and Granovetter kind of settled the issue by saying, really, it's just the highly connected people. But actually what was going on was that people like James Coleman noticed, well, look, if the innovation is relatively safe, then it spreads from central actors. But this is the opposite of what Granovetter said. If it's a risky innovation, something that's like not quite well understood, it tends to spread from marginal actors out in the periphery. And the reason for this is that people who are highly connected, and I talk about this in my work in the context of simple and complex contagion, people who are highly central are also highly constrained. And there's this great quote from Becker from 1970, basically making the point very clearly that, opinion leaders prefer, when they're spreading ideas, normative, low-risk innovations, whereas people, out in the periphery, the high-risk innovators who are, spreading things that are more contentious or less normative, typically have, local ties that are more clustered because that reduces their opposition from like the rest of the network. So what's going on here, just to show that just kind of graphically, is that, someone who's highly connected has lots of, essentially we think of them as outgoing ties for spreading. But when that person is deciding whether or not to adopt something, all these outgoing ties become incoming ties, right? They're like all of these people are looking at you and evaluating what you're doing, and of course on social media, commenting on what you're doing. So if what you're going to do is difficult or innovative or challenges the status quo, you want to be careful before doing that, because you can very quickly lose your status as an opinion leader or an influencer if you do something that offends a lot of people. A great example of this was like when Trump took power, everyone thought that he was influencing people not to wear masks because he was so highly connected. But think about, when Joe Biden was running for president, if he stopped wearing a mask, the Democrats weren't going to stop wearing masks. They just would have thought that Joe Biden was, a bad leader. So the leadership has kind of two sides, where if you're looking at simple things that people don't really think about, sure, you can influence lots of people. But when you're looking at things that a population is normatively committed to, then the influencer, the highly connected person, actually isn't so much an influencer as much as they are highly constrained and influenced by the networks around them. And of course, now we've got lots of data. So you can go back to 1970 with the very few data sets on like institutional change. But of course, since 2012, 2011, you've got the spread of social movements, the spread of social technologies, the spread of support for things like same-sex marriage and Black Lives Matter, just all these kinds of like initiatives that spread over social networks, and they all kind of give the same evidence, which is this idea that things are spreading more effectively from the periphery than the center. So this is a pretty stark paradox for our classic theories. And as you can anticipate, I'll talk very briefly about simple and complex contagion, but what I want to do is something different. So in the book, Change, I emphasize that's actually the periphery is where innovation spreads from. But I'm going to take our thinking significantly further today. And this is going to be the kind of intellectually challenging part of the talk. Instead of talking about this tension between, on the left-hand side, things, this tension between, on the left-hand side, things spreading from the center outward as our theory, and on the right-hand side, all the data saying things spread from the outside to the inside, I want to say what's actually going on here is something even more theoretically interesting that we have overlooked, and I had overlooked until the last couple of years, which is that the question here isn't really, does it spread from the center or does it spread from the periphery, which is the way that the problem had been framed, again, since the 1970s. The question here really is, where is the center of the network? Because it's almost by definition that if something's spreading, it's spreading from the center. So really the issue is, it looks to me like the center of the network is in one location on the left-hand side, but on the right-hand side, we've got the kind of network diagram wrong. The center of the network is somewhere else. And so that's what I'm going to focus on today, is finding the center of the network. And now, so this is the sort of the big picture of what we're going to talk about. So basically, 3 easy steps, borrow a phrase from Feynman. What I want to convince you of today, the goal of this talk, is to show you that first, once we understand simple and complex contagions, which I'm going to go through very briefly, I'm going to assume everyone knows it, but for in case anyone needs a refresher, it's a quick recap of that distinction. But I'm going to show you that once we have that distinction firmly in mind, we can then derive the following result, that the kind of contagion spreading across a network actually determines the measure of connectedness in that network, which is to say, network topology is not a fixed property. Because the way that I have talked about this, everyone has talked about this, for, again, since the 50s, is, look, there's a graph, and there's stuff spreading on the graph. And what I've come to appreciate is that's a fundamentally wrong conception of how networks operate. The properties of the graph, distance, and topology and path length, are actually determined by what's spreading. So once I convince you of that the actual notion of connectedness is determined by the kind of contagion, then I'm going to go another step further and say, well, now, once we understand that, where the center of the network is actually determined by connectedness, which is to say centrality is fundamentally based on the concept of path length. Centrality is saying this is the location that's the closest or the lowest path length to all the locations. So if we change our conception of social distance, then we also change our conception of centrality. which means, and this is the punchline of the talk here, that understanding what kind of contagion is spreading on a network actually tells you where the center of the network is. And as the type of contagion changes, the center of the network actually moves. And what I'm going to show you is that what we have traditionally called the periphery is only from the perspective of the traditional notion of centrality. If you look at these other kinds of contagions, the center of the network is where the periphery used to be. So I'll make this more clear, but that's the sort of big idea here. And of course, the punchline is, once we understand this, this isn't just like an artifact of a set of nice theoretical definitions. We can test this empirically, this prediction about where the center of the network will be depending on what kind of contagion we're using. And then we can actually go out and do some policy with it. We can build large-scale interventions in countries based on the kind of contagion we're looking at and identify central influencers in very counterintuitive ways. Okay, so very quickly, contagion is simple and complex, then into the meat of it. We're going to talk about social connectedness and how to define it, based this sort of new definitions of social connectedness based on how the contagion affects network distance. And once we nail that down and have that very clear, then we're going to shift directly to network centrality and talk about all the measures of network centrality we've had. This is going to be, the paper and the work on this are meant to be really comprehensive. So we look at all these different measures of centrality and show that the new measure of centrality that I discussed today is qualitatively distinct from everything we've had historically because it relies on a new conception of network distance. Fine, all that's very nice. I can show you the results and it's consistent and clear, but I think there's always the worry that it all just becomes like a self-contained system. You say, well, if you define things this way, then you can make a bunch of proofs, sure. What I want to show you is that once we can do that, we can now make very large-scale empirical predictions about which people are going to be influential in which circumstances, and those predictions hold up. And then finally, once we can do that, then we can go do real policy. Okay, part one, contagiousness. This is just a very simple review of simple and complex. So for simple and complex contagions, the best way to think about it is, well, what is the difference between the novel coronavirus and wearing face masks, right? Because we all saw that coronavirus spreads very effectively across national borders, across socioeconomic groups, across race and ethnic groups. The disease doesn't care. It just cascades through networks. And of course, for a very long time, everyone thought that's how everything worked, right? Everything spreads like a virus, quote unquote. But it's compellingly false when we look at face masks, right? It's very clear that if people are wearing face masks in one group, that another group looking at them not only does not adopt the behavior, but actually is less likely to adopt the behavior because other people are wearing them. So there's a sense of opposition. And so the sheer notion of contact and exposure leading to transmission doesn't work when we look at face masks in the same way as it does the coronavirus. And this highlights the very clear distinction between a simple contagion and a complex contagion. Simple contagions are just like COVID-19, but the measles, influenza, and gossip, where one person shows up, this person in black, and they introduce a contagion into the network. Now the person in the middle is exposed, they become infected, and then they spread it to everybody else. And this is, of course, the classic notion of how diffusion works. It's certainly what someone like Gladwell has in mind. And that seems intuitive, but there's kind of a problem, which is, well, what happens if the behavior is sort of difficult or goes against our norms? Because what this assumes is basically every contact is tantamount to transmission. There's no resistance. Everything that's spreading is basically easy, familiar, and low cost. All right, so what happens if a behavior comes into a neighborhood and that person in the middle now is looking at adopting a face mask? Well, the person who's shown in black is wearing a face mask, that's fine, but the person in the middle doesn't just say, oh, look, here's a behavior for me to adopt. She looks around at all of her other neighbors and notices that no one else is wearing a face mask. So those people don't have to say or do anything in particular. They just have to not adopt the behavior. And at that point, they are implicitly countervailing influences against the one person trying to spread the contagion. This is a core difference between simple and complex contagion. Where for simple contagion, exposure is enough. For complex contagion, you've got all these countervailing influences that are pushing back against the exposure. So now you need another person. Still, that may not be sufficient because there's still a minority in that person's network. Maybe a third person, and that's sufficient, and the person finally adopts. So what's going on here is, and this is the way it's largely formalized in the threshold model, is we say multiple contacts are needed for transmission, which is distinct from simple contagion. But it's not just that. It's relative to everyone you know, and it's also these implicit countervailing influences pushing back when you see someone adopting new behavior. And the fewer people there are adopting the behavior, the more the behavior seems like deviant or risky, and the less likely you are to adopt it. So it's really the countervailing influences that are doing a lot of work here. So this resistance to behavior anytime is difficult and familiar cost. And obviously this is true for everything from wearing a face mask to adopting expensive technology to anything that's in the space of norms, where in the space of norms, you're always dealing with the issue of countervailing influences from non-adopters. Okay, so that should be just a very quick review. Now, we're going to get into the meat of the discussion on social connectedness. So what is a tie? So we've all seen graphs like this for years, starting in grad school or before, and everyone says, okay, what's the characteristic path length of the network? What's the clustering? What are these basic features? And the intuition has been, well, you can just measure that and then do dynamics. So I'm going to problematize that. So the way we measure social connections typically, and this goes back to, again, the 1950s as well, there are links that connect people. So we have node A and node B. And so we ask a question like, what is the social distance? This is tricky because what we're going to do is we're going to try to mathematize. Social distance is a rich concept. There's a lot of subtlety built into that sociologically, but we want to do something theoretically efficient that allows us to do some nice math. So we say, okay, well, social distance basically just means the number of steps to travel from A to B. It seems reasonable. It seems like we haven't done a huge violence to the concept. This all seems reasonable enough, but this actually turns out to be tricky because when you look at the distance between A and B, the question is, well, what kind of bridges, what kinds of connections are sufficient for something to travel from A to B? So the classic way we talk about this is what I refer to as narrow bridges. So basically a single tie, right? If there's a tie, then there's a step and something can travel a step. But that fundamentally assumes that the thing is traveling as a simple contagion. In other words, that a narrow bridge is sufficient. But what if the thing that's traveling is a complex contagion? So it requires multiple reinforcing sources. Well, then by definition, one link is insufficient. So now ask yourself, looking at this graph, what is the distance between A and B? Well, if we're talking about a simple contagion, then we use the measure of what traditionally is called path length, but now has been in this study and in our publications defined as simple path length. Because essentially, if we're saying, look, if A and A's two neighbors, that red triangle, are activated, and the thing they're activated with is a simple contagion, then what is the shortest path between A and B, right? Traveling across narrow bridges. Well, it's pretty clear that it's just one step, right? So the simple path length or the narrow bridge path is, that link from A to B. So the answer is the distance between A and B, or the shortest distance between A and B, is one step. Okay, that's clear enough. Now, what happens when the thing is spreading as a complex contagion? And this is where the new measure of path length is based on complexity. So if we say neighborhood A is activated, and we want to know how many steps it takes to get to neighborhood B, but in order to spread the contagion from one person to another, it requires multiple reinforcing ties, then it's clear that the link from A to B is not going to be a sufficiently wide bridge. So how does the contagion travel, and what is the shortest path? The shortest path actually travels around the network like this. It's one step, two steps, three steps, four steps, five steps, 6, 7, 8, 9. Think about this for a minute. If the thing that's spreading is a social movement or an innovative technology that encounters resistance, node B is 9 steps away from node A. But if the thing that's spreading is COVID, then node B is 1 step away. So the actual distance of A to B in the social network, the shortest path, is contingent upon the thing that's spreading in the network. So this is a big deal because it goes all the way back to our classic measures and things like small world, which Milgram and Travers were using the idea of information spreading, right? Of these these postcards, informational packets. All of computer science relied on the idea of informational packets. So internet studies and so forth. And so the vast majority of research in network science has basically assumed that what we're talking about when we're talking about path length is simple path length, right? Sufficiently short paths with narrow bridges. But now, how does all of this work, including the basic conclusion of only 6 degrees of separation in large networks like the US or the world? How does that translate into complex pathway when the contagion spreading is complex? All of a sudden, distances in social networks look very different, which helps to explain why we see regional divisions, why things don't just spread everywhere all the time, why something like Twitter actually had to spread from neighborhood to neighborhood to neighborhood across the San Francisco Bay Area over the course of years to reach different cities instead of just spreading across the internet, because it was a complex contagion. It was a complementary technology that required coordination with peers, not just a disease, right? And so it explains why some technologies take years to spread, while some diseases take weeks to spread, because the path length of the network is really different for something like COVID-19 and for something like adoption of Twitter. Okay, so this brings us, of course, to some punchlines about connectedness and diffusion. I'll go through these fairly quickly because I want to get to centrality. But it's worthwhile now that I've shown you this sort of new measure of path length, what you can do with it, just from a formal modeling perspective. So, okay, we've got neighborhoods on a lattice, individual, this is kind of a classic representation of neighborhoods. You have individual A shown in blue, and then A's neighbors, 2 on the left and 2 on the right. Then individual B shown in yellow, and B's neighbors, 2 on the left and 2 on the right. And then, of course, the common friends or shared neighbors, the green nodes between A and B. So now a complex contagion, there's some sufficient overlap that if A and A's friends adopt something, they can convince B and B's friends to adopt it, right? Because there's a wide bridge with reinforcing ties. But now, if the ties are rewired, there's still a link between A and B's neighborhood through the common neighbor, but there's only one neighbor. So what that means is that although a simple contagion can spread, a complex contagion can't. So the path length of the network has just shifted in a way that can shorten the distance for simple contagions, but actually lengthen the distance for complex contagions. So you have a shifting topology now that alters our measures of social distance in the opposite direction, depending on what kind of contagion you're talking about. So just to show you how effective this particular measure, so of course the paper, this is published in Nature.com, I think July of last year, 2021. What we did was just to show, conclusively this particular measure of complex path length was really the right measure for capturing the topological shift in graphs. We did the classic rewiring model that everybody knows and showed that if you look at the frequency of successful cascades and then look at the measure, the neighborhood level measure of wide bridges, actually they map on perfectly to one another. So if you look at the sort of concatenation of wide bridges, it gives you an exact prediction of how far any given cascade will spread. It doesn't have to be that model though of randomization from ordered to randomization from an ordered graph to a sorry, Flaminio, your screen is flickering mad. I'm going to try to close it. Okay, good. It's like strobe lights. All right. Okay, so this is the representation on this randomization, but we can also look at something, complex graph like a scale-free graph, and look at the average complex path length just by virtue of manipulating the structure of the scale-free graph. And what you see is that it's pretty much 1-to-1. And as the average complex path length increases, so does the proportion of adopters. So the point is, like, it doesn't require any particular stylized network graph generation algorithm. It's pretty much any network graph generation algorithm. If you measure complex path length or wide bridges, it'll give you the direct correspondence to like the frequency of successful cascades of complex contagions. So it just shows you the complex path actually is a very good measure for distance, for like how far things spread, which is to show you that it's a good measure of topology. All right, now the punchline here is going to be that any measure, in fact, every measure of centrality assumes a measure of social distance. So for some of you, this will be obvious, but for some it won't if you haven't worked on measures of centrality before. So Most of us know this kind of thing. You look at a graph, it's got a bunch of different nodes, and you say, okay, who's the most central individual? This is the kind of thing you can do in just any rudimentary social networks package. You just pick the, pick the characteristic you're interested in. So you can say eigenvector centrality, or betweenness centrality, or closeness centrality, or degree centrality, right? And you can iterate through these. And in the paper, we iterate through this entire list of measures of centrality. What you'll notice, however, beneath the surface, although these are competing measures, and people run lots of different studies to say in this optimized set of algorithmically generated graphs, this measure of centrality is the best, and other people say, well, in this empirical data sets, we find this measure of centrality to be the best. Every single one of these measures of centrality assumes that narrow bridges are sufficient. In other words, what you're looking at is a calculation across narrow bridges of how much reach a given node has. And that's the calculation of centrality. So in other words, every single measure of centrality, all of these assume that what is spreading is a simple contagion, and that the measure of distance is simple path length. So none of these give you a good expectation for, and what you'll see in a second is that these are all kind of clustered around the traditional quote unquote center, but the center of the graph is determined by your visualization algorithm. Like, we lay out the graphs with the most highly connected people using simple path length in the center of the network. So they look central. And that actually, believe it or not, that simple bias actually reinforces this intuition. So what that means, if you pick someone using a measure of complex centrality, where what we're looking at here isn't the simple path length, but actually the complex path length, that person shows up here. Now, your intuition is going to be, yeah, sure, it's yet another measure of centrality, add it to a very long list. But what I want to emphasize is that this measure of centrality is qualitatively different. And I'll show you that theoretically, but I'll also show you that empirically. It picks out a different part, not just a different node, but actually a different part of the network than any of the other measures of centrality. Okay, so the first study we ran, this is kind of a classic thing to do in simulation work. I think the right way to do simulation work is first you sort of understand the space theoretically. You say, here's the full sweep of different parameter spaces, and we can show you across that full sweep that we've got clear, consistent results that show a difference between simple path length and complex path length. Once you do that theoretical work, then it's a natural question to say, well, where do like various empirical networks? Hello? Hello? I'm sorry. Hello? It sounds like folks are talking.
Someone with the audio on, so sorry. Go on, please.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah, I can. There was just a conversation. So I lost my place here. All right, so once you do the sort of, I would emphasize that before shifting to doing empirical networks, which are idiosyncratic, they have whatever characteristics they have, it's best to do a full sweep of the theoretical space. So you kind of know what the boundaries are, whether you get consistent results across a lot of different well understood graph topologies. Once you can establish that, then you want to know whether empirical networks fall within the scope of the networks that you study theoretically. And so it turns out these do, but you don't know that ahead of time. So we took the large network data set from @Health, which people know is a very popular and well-constructed network data set. And what we did was then say, okay, we're going to use a test of centrality to identify influential nodes. And this is a simulation study. So we basically identified for every single measure of centrality, and I'll show you this in a minute, we said, okay, for degree centrality, who should be the influencer? For betweenness centrality, who should be the influencer on every single network for this entire range of thresholds? So if the threshold's 2, then we identify all the central actors based on classic notions of centrality, and then complex centrality. And then we run a series of cascade experiments replicating over hundreds times for every single location that's identified as central. And we see which location was most effective at spreading the contagion. And we do that for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. obviously it's because it's a simulation study, we can be very rigorous here. We can do um, you know, completely homogeneous thresholds, distributed thresholds, probabilistic thresholds. So we, obviously did a full sweep across this ways of characterizing thresholds. But most importantly, we did this for every single spot in the network that would be identified as central and compared it to the spot that would be identified as complex central. So this is what it looks like. So this is a typical AdHealth network. And what you can see is that degree centrality, eigenvector centrality actually pick out the same node. Percolation centrality between this centrality. So what this shows you, it's interesting, is again, this is a feature of the visualization of the graph layout, that all of these nodes appear to be near the center of the network and correspond to our sort of naive intuitions about what centrality means. But when you pick out the complex central individual, they're way out here in the periphery. And I want to emphasize the way I started this talk, which is to say, the way that I talked about this in the book and the way people have talked about this historically is to say, oh, these certain kinds of contagions spread from the periphery, whereas simple contagions spread from the center. And what I'm suggesting now is that that's actually the wrong conceptualization. The right one is that everything always spreads most effectively from the most central person. But for different contagions, centrality actually shifts. And so for simple contagions, centrality is going to be around what is perceived here to be the middle of the network for simple path length. But for complex contagions, the central spot in the network is actually way out there where the red dot is in the perceived periphery. So this is what the results look like. Okay, so we see the way that we see these contagion experiments, these are simulations, is by picking an individual, activating their neighbors. So you can see degree centrality, that person, their neighbors, between the centrality green, percolation in orange, eigenvector centrality in fuchsia, and then complex centrality in red. So the results look like this. Basically, the classic, these are for all these different, the different complex contagions we're looking at, that for all these measures of centrality, basically you didn't get any major spreading, but for complex centrality, you get this massive impact of choosing the same size seed neighborhood, so the same seeding budget, as it were. You get just a tremendously outsized impact on change within the network. Now that's just one demonstration. Of course, we replicated this. There's 444 simulated data points here. And what you can see that's most striking is that in this graph, the light blue nodes are the ones that are complex centrality, that they significantly and consistently outperform every other measure of centrality across the entire space. Now, one other thing, this is kind of just a technical point, but I think it's important, is that if you ask, and I think this is a reasonable question to ask, well, maybe complex centrality is just picking up on something that the other, measures are picking up on too, the way that degree centrality and eigenvector centrality sort of pick up on the same things. What you'll notice here, if you look at the influence, is that for the nodes that have high betweenness centrality or high degree centrality or high eigenvector centrality, they all have very low complex centrality. And for the node that has high complex centrality, has low on all their scores. In other words, there is something unique being picked up by this measure of complex centrality that's not picked up by any other measure of centrality. And that really separates it qualitatively from the rest of the measures of centrality that we have today. So all of that is the broad theoretical development and the sort of the models and the concepts that we define and prove, and then the sort of the basic replication on quote unquote empirical data sets. Now what we want to know is, can we make predictions that we can actually test in native empirical settings? So Banerjee et al., Matt Jackson was in the study too, did this beautiful study with 43 Indian villages. It's a lot of data. Each village has its own massive complete data set, and they replicated this 43 times across India. It's a beautiful data set. So there's complete network data for each village and complete adoption data for each village. This is exactly the kind of data set you want. And what we did was we said, okay, let's use all these notions of centrality, including the ones we just tested in our model. Let's test all these notions of centrality, but of course with a focus on our measure of complex path length and complex centrality, to see in this empirical data set which households were the most effective households. Now what they're looking at is the fusion of a microfinance program. So this should be a really critical test because if there's anything, the one thing that could happen is that all spots are equally good. Another thing that can happen is that a bunch of the classic notions of centrality actually turn out to be pretty good. But another thing can happen is that they're all terrible, right? Like it's just the wide world of empirical data. But what winds up happening is that there's this really clear signal. If you look at complex path length, it is the single greatest predictor of which villages are going to be most successful. If the villages with the greatest complex path length, in other words, the most wide bridges, are the villages that were most successful in spreading the microfinance program adoption. Most compellingly, if you look at the households the households that were most effective at spreading microfinance throughout the entire village for all 43 independent village experiments, you see that between a centrality, eigenvector centrality, degree centrality, K-core, and percolation centrality are all indistinguishable from random chance, from just picking a node at random. It's only complex centrality that has a significant direct effect on using that particular household to seed the microfinance program. That, to me, is incredibly compelling evidence because it's the kind of thing that, like, they didn't design the microfinance study to test anything about complex centrality. So there's no sort of built-in expectations. It's really just saying, let's look at what they did and see if our theory can predict the most effective households, and it does a great job. Okay, so then very quickly, I want to wrap this up by talking about what we can call policy application, which is, all right, instead of looking, after the fact and being able to predict something about a data set, can we say, this is how you could advise a government to shift policies? In this case, this is Malawi. So the big problem in Malawi, and I did talk about this in the book. I have a section in chapter 10 that talks about this. It's an interesting study because Malawi had been trying to shift its method of planting for years, and it's a big deal because it was basically like producing like 20% of its available farming product because of the poor farming style. And it turns out that, like a lot of things, it's actually a social norm because people had learned this method of farming from their parents and their grandparents, and it's just kind of what people did. And then the government said, actually, if you just plant your plants in a slightly different way, then you'll get 80, 90% more yield out of your farm. And they did all these government outreach programs year after year. And after almost 10 years, they only had less than 1% of farmers actually adopt it, this is famously the problem for, this is why we study this as sociologists and social scientists, is because having a solution does not mean people use the solution, right? This is the classic problem of innovation and technology adoption. Obviously, it's a problem with vaccination too in some countries and parts of the world. Just because you've solved the problem technologically doesn't mean people will use it. And so the world is still stuck in the sort of old state. So it's a question of adoption and a question of speed. So what the government had been doing was saying, okay, we're going to find, this is the classic notion of influences. We're going to find the most charismatic, popular people in each village and get them to advertise this new planting method. And of course, that had been a colossal failure for years. And so the idea here is, well, look, what I told you earlier about influencers was that they're usually highly reluctant to adopt an innovation because they've got so much social pressure. But I think the classic response from folks is to say, well, look, I get that. And I understand that there's countervailing influences. But what if I can give an influencer, someone who's highly connected, someone with high degree centrality or eigenvector centrality, so much money? I give them a dump truck of cash. They just can't resist adopting this thing. Then wouldn't it be the case that just because of their adoption, then this thing would take off? And so that would be this kind of situation where you have a complex network and you can just somehow incentivize this influencer to adopt and eliminate the pressure from countervailing influences. And then you get this sort of beautiful viral cascade. And this is what we all kind of imagine should happen when we work with influencers. The problem here is what I've been talking about throughout the talk, is the problem of the shifting center, which is that when it comes to anything that's normative, this location is no longer the center of the network. It is for a simple contagion, but actually, not only is the central person surrounded by countervailing influences, but all their neighbors are too, and all their neighbors are too, right? So even if that central person might get one or two people, those people are still surrounded by countervailing influences, as are their neighbors. It's just not the right way to get this contagion off the ground. However, and I think this is the truly compelling insight, if you look at the same identical network structure with the same level of resistance and just target your efforts out here in this sort of particular neighborhood located in what we perceive to be the periphery, but what is actually identified as the complex center of the network, you get something that looks very different. You get a cascade process that doesn't just jump to the center of the network. It actually cascades in a very deliberate fashion through wide bridges around the periphery of the network until it reaches what is essentially a critical mass. And that's the point at which it speeds up, moves through the center, and then sort of cascades out to the rest of the network. And so they ran this study. This is a really fun story about the economists who did this. There's a massive, it took them 4 years to run this one experiment. They basically broke the entire country of Malawi into like a perfect randomized controlled experiment, 50 villages, where they used the viral strategy in 50 villages, the influencer strategy, and the complex strategy, and did a very beautiful controlled experiment, at a national level with a real policy. And so this is, the degree centrality or influencer look like that. The viral baseline, which just choose a bunch of people everywhere to get maximum exposure. And of course, the complex centrality strategy was to pick this small cluster out here in the periphery. And what they found was something like quite striking. In the first year of this, they went back every year to see what the effects were of their intervention. The villages who had used the sort of complex centrality measure increased by 200% over other villages in their knowledge of this new planting method. The year after that, the knowledge translated into uptake. So there was a 200% increase uptake. And by the end of the study, which was the third year, the method of influence that worked the least was the influencer strategy. Second place was the viral strategy, which basically is like a random baseline. So the influencer did worse than the random baseline. And then the complex centrality strategy had a 300% improvement in uptake of this farming above the viral strategy. So in conclusion, a lot of our thinking about networks relies on these sorts of intuitions that are kind of playing in the background that we're not entirely aware of. And my view is that just because someone tells you you have an intuition and kind of brings it to your awareness doesn't actually change your intuition. It just gives you the capacity to sort of self-monitor. The network on the left looks fast. It just does. It's like when you look at it, you see, look, if they get that person in the center activated, they're going to activate everyone else. And it'd be very hard to have you look at that and not see it as like fast. It's like, a red sports car just looks fast. But what I want to help you see is that when we see that intuition, what we're actually imagining is something from epidemiology. We're actually imagining it without really knowing it is we're looking at simple contagions. Once we start to think about complexity, it's to start to change our intuitions a little bit. So now we can see the network on the right and how the reinforcing clustered structure actually helps to grow an effective critical mass, which can shift a population much more effectively than the network on the left. And so the punchline here really is that the notion that I and many others have relied upon for decades, that we can just talk about graph structure independent from graph dynamics, is not correct. That in order to properly understand the structure of a network, what the connectedness is, what the social distance is, and where the center is, we need to understand the dynamics on the graph as well. And so I talked about this in terms of the difference between simple and complex path length, and fundamentally in terms of notions of centrality. So with that, I am happy to take your questions. Thanks very much.
So thank you, Damon. Very inspiring, and we have 15 minutes for a question. Carlo, please help me with the question from the Zoom. There is a first question on the back.
That was super interesting. Thanks a lot. You describe your complex contagion as normative, but as you presented it, it seems as if it's simply a critical mass where you need a certain number of your direct neighbors to adopt if you're going to adopt. So that's the first question. And then if my interpretation is correct, Have you done experiments where different actors or nodes in the network require lesser or greater numbers of neighbors to adopt in order to adopt?
Sure. Let me answer your first question first. So let's be clear, and I'm just going to be technical here for a second, and then I'll get more substantive. So when I say that it's normative, this is kind of a like Venn diagram thing. It's not that all complex contagions are normative. It's that all normative behaviors are complex contagions. Does that make sense? So the point is that there are some situations in which people do require multiple sources of reinforcement, but behavior isn't actually normative in any sense. It's just people are risk averse or something like this. And so the more people who adopt a product, the more credible it is that thing isn't going to like kill you or one of your family members, because there's a sense of social safety with reinforcing adopters. That doesn't actually mean that there's any sense of social approval at work, right? So there's a difference between the concept of credibility and the concept of legitimacy. And so certainly things that require credibility are complex contagions and that they're not normative. But the point here is, for a lot, almost all of the behaviors that we think about and care about when we think about social change, there is a normative component. There's a component in which I'm looking at people to see not just who's adopting something, but who's not adopting it. And whenever you're doing that, whenever the non-adopters are kind of implicitly weighing against making a decision, that means you're looking at how people look at you. You're aware of the kind of legitimacy of the behavior socially. And that's the context I refer to as normative. So there are many mechanisms for complex contagion, and not all of them are normative. Just one of them is what I call legitimacy. But legitimacy actually encompasses a large number of behaviors. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I just
Okay.
wanted to understand the technical nature of your experiments. And that did relate to just the critical mass in terms of numbers of neighbors adopting, right?
Yeah. So for the simulations, there is no normativity. The way that normativity is formalized is to think about the difference between absolute thresholds and fractional thresholds. So absolute thresholds is to say, I need at least 4 people to adopt, right? And then it doesn't really matter how many other neighbors I know. If 4 people adopt, I adopt. But if thresholds are fractional, right? And again, there's a substantive version of this that I think is actually more interesting and more important. But the technical version, it seems to me what you're asking about, the technical version is when thresholds are fractional, then it actually does matter how many neighbors I have. Because if I have 100 neighbors, then 4 out of 100 isn't very many. But if I have 8 neighbors, then 4 out of 8 is a huge fraction, right? And so that's when normativity, and so the way to think about normativity in a formal context is to say, well, when it's normative, thresholds are fractional. And when it's something like credibility or something like sheer complementarity, then it's often just absolute thresholds. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm going to pass it on to another question at this point. Thank
Do you want me to? You had a second part, though. I'm happy to
The
answer.
second one is even take the fractional. Have you done experiments where different agents in the network require different fractions of neighbors
Certainly.
to adopt in order to adopt?
Certainly. There's this book changes them, is the recent one. It's written for a wider policy audience, but the first book, How Behavior Spreads, spends a lot of time talking about these issues, because in the initial papers, back to the 2007 paper, which introduces the concept of complex contagion, there's a long several-page discussion about these issues, and also in that book, there's a long discussion about these issues about representing thresholds as static, thresholds as dynamic, as changing over time, thresholds as fractional, fractional and absolute, thresholds as probabilistic, and all combinations, right? This is, when in a book like that, you have space to do all the different versions, and showing across all different permutations that these results are robust. So,
Okay,
I would refer you to
I would say what I'm referring to is
the probabilistic thresholds. Yeah, so yes, the results are robust to that, and I described that in detail in the 2007 paper. And also, obviously, I've done experiments on this, like the 2010 Science paper shows experimentally. And then also in these experiments, the one I just showed you, we also do it with fixed thresholds, probabilistic thresholds, and so forth. So I think that's just part of being rigorous when you're doing simulations.
Okay, great. I'll look at those papers. Thanks.
Great. Mhm.
Okay, thank you for this chat. We have two questions from one Bruce and Norman. Please, Bruce Edmonds.
Hello, thank you very much for the talk, Damon. It was really interesting. Presumably, I'm sort of imputing this from what you said, there will be a whole class of different kinds of complex contagions depending on the society and the issue and stuff like that, which may fall into broad category, like ones that can be modeled as a threshold, and maybe ones that require not the opposite viewpoint occurring and stuff like that. Is that your general intention? And thus we have to define all these things like centrality with respect to how a particular thing spreads in that context.
Yeah, that's right. So let me preface my response by saying, obviously I have, there are talks in which I spend the entire talk talking about complex contagion. So that stuff is now like thoroughly worked out in these two books. So I don't really talk about that stuff in so much detail in the talks anymore. But yes, that's right. That in brief, I would say the way to think about complex contagions isn't so much to think about thresholds. That's just a formalization. The way to think about them as mechanisms is what I was just mentioning, like credibility, legitimacy, and this is when and particularly in this newer book, the recent one, Change. Like the natural question is to say, okay, give me a classification scheme. Which behaviors are complex and which are simple? And the right way to think about it, both the scientifically sophisticated way and the policy relevant way, is to say, well, why is something complex? Is it the need for credibility? Okay, so let's look at that. Why do people require additional credibility for this and not for that? Or is there legitimacy? And this is when you can say a question I like, a nice way of talking about it, something like the behavior of cooperating. So with cooperation, it's a natural kind of question to ask, but it's unfortunately the kind of thing that's like, it's a pre-theoretic question, right? It's like once you internalize the theoretical distinctions being made, you see, oh, okay, it's actually not the right way to ask the question. So the intuitive way to ask the question is something like cooperation simple or complex? Okay, but the way you want to think about it is to say, well, look, there are societies where that's part of the background normative expectation. So cooperation is actually a simple contagion because it's what everyone already expects of you. And then, of course, societies, the US being a great example, where that actually isn't the background expectation. So cooperation is actually a harder thing to mobilize and does require social reinforcement. And so, the behavior itself is mapped onto the question of, well, does this require legitimacy in order for me to feel comfortable doing it? And once we answer that, it becomes less abstract. We say, yeah, in this context for this thing, people do require legitimacy. And then straight off it's a complex contagion. So that's the way to think about it, not in terms of behaviors, but in terms of the mechanisms, which it sounds abstract, but actually it's what this book does is show it's really concrete. You can talk about solar panels this way. Like it's really clear that once you start talking about the reasons why people adopt solar panels, it is incredibly normative. Like the most consistent results on the adoption of solar panels are that they spread neighborhood to neighborhood in every single case, regardless of the financial incentives, regardless of good environmental advertising. They spread, when clusters of households adopt solar panels, all of their neighbors start adopting solar panels because it's just kind of what's expected. It's very similar to the way that people started putting out those blue recycle bins, and then recycling spread like from block to block because everyone could see the bins, and that became reinforcing. So we can always model this in terms of thresholds, but it's important to see what's underneath those thresholds so that you can go do policy and say, okay, this is the situation in which we'll be able to trigger that effect.
So this gives all the people in a room a lot of work to do, because if we observe different kinds of processes, we should be out there simulating them to find what might be the simplifications, a way of identifying in particular things for that particular kind of process. Right?
Yeah,
so we have a lot of work.
Science requires good work, that's for sure. But I think that the broad classifications here are useful because it turns out to be easier than you think once you start just looking at a problem to say, are people basically trying to coordinate with other people? Is that what's going on? Like they're not worried about social approval, they're just worried, you can see the class of behavior called social media is basically people just trying to figure out what other people are going to do, because what you don't want to be is on a social media platform no one's using. the whole point is just to, it's a communication technology. You just want to use the platform other people are using. So complexity just comes from the need to coordinate. And once you understand that, then it's like, okay, it's just a coordination problem. So then let's just figure out how to, identify the parts of the network where we get coordination off the ground fastest. And you can see that's exactly the cascade process that, both Facebook and Twitter followed. So it's, once you get those things locked in, it actually becomes pretty straightforward.
Okay, thank you for this interesting chat. I will strongly recommend the next people to ask very brief questions. And please, Damon, try to be brief in your answers. We are running out of time.
Sure.
There is Norman now, and please try to be brief. Thank you.
Certainly. So this is a comment, and it's not meant as a criticism. The contagion idea reminds me of this selfish mem concept that is kind of out of favor, largely because
You mean the selfish gene?
No, the selfish mem. There's a whole kind of body of literature that played off of the selfish gene.
Right. You're talking about, I just wanted to know whether you're talking about the original or the derivative. You're talking about selfish
No.
meme. Okay, got it.
And it largely fell out of favor because the messenger was more important than the message because of the social network. And just a comment on that would be interesting. And then kind of the two success stories you gave were fairly homogeneous culturally. And so how would the ideas apply to a more complex society with multiple social identities, etc.?
Yeah, there's a good response that ties in both your questions, which is the spread of support for marriage equality, which is interesting because the story is that it spread across Facebook to 2.7 million people in 1 week. And it's a campaign across a very diverse set of people on Facebook in the US. But it's also something where you would say, wow, that's a really successful, what it was changing your profile to the pink and red equal sign to show support. It turns out it wasn't viral or simple. The folks at Facebook did this really nice study to identify what kind of contagion it was, and it was clearly a complex contagion. People needed upwards of 10 people to adopt that they were connected to in order to adopt, which raises the fundamental question, well, how did it spread so fast then? And it turns out that the people in your network did matter. It wasn't just you needed like 10 reinforcing signals. It was 10 reinforcing signals from whom? In the first book, I emphasize homophily a lot. When I balance out some of my experiments focus on population composition, and some focus on population topology. And so in trying to balance these out, I show what the relationship is between the structural talk, which is what my talk today focused on, versus how people are distributed and how that affects things. In this book, I go beyond the concept of homophily in ways I think are significant and important, because one of the really interesting results from the spread of the marriage equality campaign on Facebook is that the reinforcing signals that were most effective weren't from people like you. They were from diverse people in your network. And the reason is because, again, this is what I was talking about before, the mechanism for complexity was social risk. So if you see a bunch of people who are like you, who share all your values, who are from like your high school friend group, all adopting and reinforcing this social signal of support for marriage equality, on Facebook, you're also connected to your grandparents and your work colleagues, right? Your neighbors. And so just showing support from like one cluster of people who are all like you doesn't really give you a sense that is broadly legitimate. But once you appreciate that the issue is something that's broadly legitimate, then having actually 10 people adopt, but like one is like, one of your grandparents, some of your neighbors, some of your colleagues from work, some of your friends from high school, this gives you a sense that those 10 reinforcing signals actually represent a broad swath of society. And that's more compelling than a bunch of people who are just homophilous. And so really, yes, the composition of the reinforcing signals matters a lot. And it matters differently depending on which mechanism we're engaging. For something like a health behavior, then homophily actually matters more, because you want to find people who have your exact health condition. And those are the people who are most influential for you. So both the compositional element and the structural element depend on the mechanisms for complexity.
So thank you. We are running out of time, so unfortunately we can take any more questions. And Damon, thank you very much for this brilliant, inspiring talk. And I hope that at some point we will see each other in another meeting. And if you want to stay connected, there's a now we so thank you.
Oh, thank you.
These are kind of talks that we can go on ages discussing, and so very, very inspiring. So please, Damon, can you stop sharing your wow? Fantastic.